Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for staying with us, those of you in the room. And those connected remotely, thank you for tuning in. We heard this morning a lot about high-tech, digitalization, artificial intelligence, and now in the afternoon we zoomed out a little bit to energy situation that we have in Europe, but also globally. In my mind, there is no partnership without trusted connectivity. I also think that it's very difficult to talk about the future of Europe, or the free world for that matter, without talking about what's happening in Ukraine these days. And I equally think that it's very difficult to talk about big projects materializing without financing being found for those projects. We have a distinguished panel here, and we are testing out our own technical capabilities, I understand. So we have three people, speakers here in the audience, and we have two connected remotely, respectively from Ukraine, Tomáš Fiala, the CEO and the founder of Dragon Capital, and also for a maximum 10 years serving as the chairman of the European Business Association in Ukraine. We have Marco Francini from the EIB, European Investment Bank, connecting to us from Vilnius, I understand. He really wanted to be here in person today, but apparently the physical connectivity doesn't quite work as well, so we are settling for the digital option here. With me on the furthest left from your end, Mark Bowman, Vice President, Policy and Partnerships of the EBRD, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Mark comes to us from the brand new office in London of EBRD. We have Andres Sutt, member of the Parliament, until very recently a Minister of Entrepreneurship and IT. He's also currently a council member of the Central Bank of Estonia, and formerly the Vice President of the same Central Bank of Estonia. Has also been involved in ESM, or the European Stability Mechanism, one of the IFIs taking care of the financial stability in Europe. And then finally, Howie Lau comes to us from Singapore, NSC, which is a group, the leader of the digital services in Southeast Asia, and has also a telecom business in the group. We have a difficult task ahead of us. We have about 55 minutes, and we need to accommodate a lot of topics here. I would like to cover a few things, such as what are the financing sources to talk about. Secondly, what has changed now this year, and how do we prioritize and reshuffle the short-term needs with the long-term goals? And then finally, what sort of standards and regulation do we need for infrastructure, all the way from energy to transport, telecoms, digital, and so on. And then blend to all of that, I think also how can the public and the private sector work together? Because the demand is huge, and I think the public and the private sector together is the only option to do it. With this, I would like to maybe ask Mark to first give a glimpse of how does the EBRD see the sources of financing, working across the 38 economies, and of course having nearly twice as many shareholders in the bank. Mark.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Andrei, and real pleasure to be here on this panel. So to give you a quick answer to your question, clearly the financing needs are enormous, whether you're looking at what's necessary to meet the SDGs, to meet the climate transition, infrastructure needs, whether it be digital or physical. And I think this is very, very well accepted, but clearly the burden is more than the burden that the public sector can bear in terms of pressure on public finances, in terms of debt positions. So there's an incredibly important role for the private sector, mobilizing private sector money. On the other side of the equation, there's lots of discussion about the kind of availability of capital and the large pools of capital that are available for investment. And in a sense, the challenge is connecting that pool of capital to the projects, to the investments. So I think the main point I want to make is not just about the EBRD, but about the IFIs in general, and our potential very important catalytic role that we can play in terms of mobilizing investment. Now, the EBRD, Andrea, you know the EBRD extremely well from your past experience, but we have a mandate, a transition mandate to support countries' transition to sustainable private sector, market-based economies. We focus mainly on the private sector. And we have what we think is a unique combination of combining investments with policy dialogue, with technical assistance. And to give you a flavour of this, where I think we are at our best is where we work with a country, in one of our countries of operation. For example, we work helping them with their regulatory framework. We then help with project preparation. We invest in a project. We either invest in the project, bringing some private sector investments alongside us, or we create the conditions that the private sector is subsequently able to invest, either through a kind of demonstration effect or creating the market conditions. And that's in essence what we are about as an organization, helping countries become sustainable, helping them to invest private capital. I think the final point, and I know we're short of time, so I'll be very quick. I think the final point on this is that it's very different. It depends on the country-specific circumstances. There will be different barriers to investment in different countries, where either lack of skills for project preparation, or not the right regulatory framework, or political risks, or economic risks. And it's important to understand that. And there again is a very important role for the IFIs, the MDBs, in terms of understanding what the constraints are in a particular country and trying to see what can be done to unblock them. Sometimes I feel that this debate gets a little bit too simplistic, in the sense that people say, well, if only the IFIs, the MDBs could take more risk, then suddenly this wall of money would flow. Actually, the world is more complicated than that, but we do have an incredibly important role to play.
Thank you. So to put it simply, you need different sources of financing, you need different forms of financing. You need the equity in the project, and then debt financing, you have variety of sources, be it working with commercial banks or the house banks for the corporates, working with capital markets or the bond market for that matter, and finally the IFIs. And I think that the link that you mentioned, Mark, is very important, that the IFIs really try to create the long-term structure so that it wouldn't be a one-off, yes, we can take more risk, we go in, nobody else follows, and that's it. But it's rather to create an environment that would then enable attracting private sector financing. I would like to bring in now Tomáš. You have been in Ukraine for a very long time. Ukraine is the center of attention at this point, certainly in this part of the world. And you have been working both with attracting investors, but also making investments in the country. Can you maybe give us a few words of what has changed? How do you see the investment appetite? Is it the wrong time to talk about these things to be able to bring in foreign investors, yet the needs are now for this coming winter? Over to you, Tomáš.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Andre. Thank you for inviting me. Indeed, the goals these days in Ukraine are not about building new infrastructure, but first of all, preserving the infrastructure that we have. Ukraine has now kind of three top priorities. One of them is military. It's the first one. Second is fiscal sustainability and fiscal support from abroad. And the third one is maintaining throughout the war the infrastructure that we have, that has so far served us surprisingly well. I guess nobody would have expected when the war started that over the last 7 months everything will be functioning well, whether it's telecoms, electricity, gas, and etc. We have supplies of food and so on, heat, canalization, and so on. So far, so far better than expected. Obviously, there are regions, especially in the east or in the occupied territories, where the situation is substantially worse. But for instance, Kiev, where I have been the last 7 months, which was deserted by 75% of its population when the war started, is now back to about 80-85% of the pre-war population, and this infrastructure is able to cope with that. But as we have seen today, Russia is targeting this infrastructure. Today they targeted in particular telecoms and energy, electricity. And today's evening will be probably the hardest we have ever had here during the peak hours. Russia has today sent us about 84 missiles and 24 kamikaze drones, and they have unfortunately hit more than 10 objects of electricity and telecom infrastructure, and some cities we already have lack of electricity during the day. I have been today whole day in the office, so fortunately we have had electricity here, mainly supplied by the city or through a generator in the morning. But here in Ukraine right now, until the war is over, it's about preserving the infrastructure we have and repairing the damages, especially the substations, the electric substations that Russia has been targeting already since the beginning of September, when they started losing on the eastern front. What the war, and perhaps last thing to give space to other speakers, what has also happened due to the war, Ukraine used its seaports for almost 70% of its exports and imports, and they have been blocked by Russia. There is now an exemption for the last 2 months for grain exports, but we have lost this way of trading with the rest of the world. So the only way to trade is now by rail and trucks with Europe, and we face a lot of bottlenecks, unfortunately, there. Not from the Ukrainian side, surprisingly. Ukraine has been able to mobilize itself extremely quickly under pressure. It doesn't have time for some bureaucratic procedures or for summer holidays. But we face a lot of bottlenecks on the European side, both accepting on the incoming rail as well as truck traffic. We have truck lines of up to a week, which are hindering Ukraine's exports into Europe, in particular on the Polish border, but also on the Romanian border. So there we need a much quicker and with bureaucratic support from these EU countries to accept this load. The same is the case for rail. We have now 40,000 rail cars stuck on the border because Europe doesn't have enough locomotives and rail cars to accept this traffic. So these are some of the bottlenecks that we are facing.
Thank you for the update from the front line. Ukraine's problems, of course, are of very different magnitude. So whenever we think it's hard, we need to think how hard it is in Ukraine. And even today, during the ministerial lunch, we heard again the deputy minister from Ukraine thanking all our countries to do for what we are doing for Ukraine, but we should also not forget to thank Ukraine for what they are doing, standing up for the democracy and against the evil on the front line. I would like to continue with Marko, who is the regional head of European Investment Bank for the Baltic countries. Closer to home, Marko, how do you see the demand for financing, both for EIB, but also how much demand has increased, and is there enough supply that you can co-finance with to satisfy that demand?
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for this invitation. So what I can say is that investing in infrastructure is one of the key priorities, together with environment, innovation, SMEs. Investing in infrastructure and connectivities are very often what we do. partly because of EU desire to strengthen partnership within and outside EU. And connectivity in digital energy and transport are and will continue to be a significantly important for the bank. In terms of project demand, I believe there are big challenges ahead of us, also considering our targets in terms of climate action and climate neutrality for the country. So there is huge demand for investment in the energy sector. And of course, we can start by talking about energy efficiency, but also transmission, digital network, and of course, cleaner transport. I believe that one thing that is very important, it was mentioned also by EBRD, is how to combine financial support and also involvement of the private sector. And this can be done only through a good coordination between international financial institutions, European Commission, local government, and many times providing technical advisory, especially in less developed regions, is decisive for the implementation of such projects.
Thank you. This is not too different from what I heard from my EBRD colleagues here in the Baltics, that the demand has increased and the record numbers are being shown in terms of IFI financing, which again shows that the IFIs need to be there when need is urgent and as a response to the perfect storm we are seeing at the moment. Let me jump over to Southeast Asia and bring in Howie. You are the leader of digital services in Southeast Asia. How do you prioritize your projects? What are the key criteria other than the financial return, and how do you attract financing for these projects?
Well, maybe before I answer that, it's probably useful to just understand the background a little bit. The NCS 40 years ago was born as the National Computer Board of Singapore. So it was born originally as a government agency, chartered with growing digital talent, the computerization of civil service, and growing the computer services industry in Singapore. Back in '81, it was called the computer services industry. Fast forward today, when we look at investments over a time horizon, I think you can look at it as 4 intersecting circles. One circle, obviously, is we try and understand very deeply what the customer needs are, because we work closely with a lot of governments. So understanding what the government needs are is one big bubble. Understanding what the banks are looking for is one big bubble. The second bubble that we have to look at is the technology bubble. We talk quite a fair bit today about AI, but I think many of us who are in the tech sector knows that there's a lot of other new tech that's evolving on a regular basis. The good and bad thing about tech is that the slowest we'll ever be is yesterday. So things change super quickly. So we look at new tech like, for example, digital humans, cybersecurity mesh, the future of decentralization, trying to figure out what are the bets that we need to put there. Then the third bubble is the bubble of what are the areas that we do need to lean forward together with our partners. So I think Mark and Marcus spoke about the private sector involvement. So we do take an active view of what does it take for us to take a lean forward position in some of these investments. And then the last bubble is obviously the usual. My CFO would tell me the ROICs, the EBITs, the rest of it. So we kind of look at it across 4 bubbles because we do recognize that beyond the traditional investment considerations financially, we do need to take a position of trying to grow the pond together. Because if the pond is bigger, everyone benefits.
That's a great idea. When you said that we live in very fast-moving times, that reminds me of a quote that I heard Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who was also speaking this morning on the screen, saying that we live the era of the fastest change ever. However, it is the slowest change that we will see going forward, i.e. today's is the fastest and it keeps accelerating. I think that's an important point. Now, Andres, let me bring you in. You represent the government here, if I may, in a broader sense.
You may.
How do you prioritize the short-term needs and urgencies with the long-term goals, because the long-term goals still should be that we're building a more efficient, greener and better connected economy in the region, but also globally. What can the government do differently in terms of regulation standards, you know, the 2030, all the Fit for 55, all these new big slogans? But to get this done, we need to start moving today.
Yeah, I very much agree. And on the speed of a change, and this is, I think, a big and important starting point, that there is a massive opportunity. There is a massive opportunity for investment because of the disruptive changes what we are facing and seeing. Disruptive change, for me, is always something what brings mankind forward. So that, I think, is a great facilitator. Yes, now, for a government, obviously, there are always competing needs. There are pay of a serviceman, police, firefighters, medical doctors, so on and so forth, and then investment need, what you actually also need to meet, not only in energy sector, what is very topical today, but equally in a digital domain, where Estonia has really been on the forefront in creating the digital society. But of course, once you have created something, you also need to take care of it, all the cyber security related risks. So in a nutshell, I think you need to align these long-term perspectives and then the short-term choices. And I think actually the switch or a fast forward to 2030, a goal to have at least 100% of electricity consumed in Estonia generated by renewables is 8 years away, but you need to start today. And one of the key things there is permitting. And second key thing is the grid infrastructure, where I think indeed there is a big role for the state to play. There is also big role, I think, for financial institutions to play, but I think also increasingly more for a private sector, because sort of ultimately, if you talk about offshore wind, onshore wind, PV in particular, I mean, there is tons of private interest and funding available. But you need to get facilitated, particularly through investment in grid, which is the largest bottleneck here. So I don't necessarily see these objectives being conflicting. But I think what also Ukrainian war, or Russia's war in Ukraine, clearly demonstrates, it's equally important to actually protect the infrastructure. And we have seen multiple attacks in the cyber domain. We have seen physical attacks against the critical infrastructure, not only in Ukraine, but including in our neighborhood here. So these things are important, and this is where we need to invest also heavily and collectively. And I think you can use the umbrella of trusted connectivity to pull really everything together, because we need to protect, we need to be sure who are the equipment and technology providers, can we trust them, and then obviously we as a democratic world need really to work together to make sure that the world is safer and a better place going forward.
These are scary thoughts
Not
you're
really.
talking about, because even in the international waters or in the sea, the North Pole leak, these are scary things. Today we heard that Bornholm Island has no electricity, so that you can never anymore be sure, what is a sabotage and what is a malfunction of a system. So one needs to remain vigilant. Mark, would you like to come in here and maybe say a few words on top of what Andres said?
I think this question about the sort of the balance between short and medium-term objectives is very, very interesting. And I was in this fantastic venue we are here today. I was told earlier that this is an old shale oil power station. I don't think there are any plans to recommission this power station, but I think it's governments across Europe, across the world, are focused on energy security. And so quite understandably, some of them are taking decisions to rely on, how can I say, less clean energy now than they have done in the past few years. And that leads some people to worry that climate objectives are being deprioritized because of the current crisis. Actually, I'm a lot more optimistic than this, because I think that there is an amazing convergence. If you think about renewable energy, solar, wind, there is this amazing convergence between economic objectives. Renewable energy is cheap, it will provide cheaper energy. Climate objectives, obviously, because it's cleaner energy, but also energy security objectives. So the alignment of economic, climate, and energy security goals means that the strategic case for countries dramatically accelerating their transition to renewables it's a no-brainer. It's an obvious thing for countries across the world to do, and I think so many countries do get that, and hopefully this will help to accelerate the transition.
Again, I think this is one of the beauties of being a banker, because you see the whole range of projects, and what needs to happen, of course, is that you need to bring the whole value chain forward. Not only do you need renewable energy generation, you need the electricity networks, the grids. You need the energy storage opportunities. You need the corporates that are willing to go and go electric and go green. Then you need further corporates to sometimes the Nordic Investment Bank that I have the pleasure leading. Sometimes you see in one credit committee the whole range of here is a wind park, here is a grid project, here is Volvo cars going completely green and battery powered, and then there is a postal company in any of the countries that basically replaces all their fleet, and so on and so forth. And I think that is the difficult part, because if you only do one portion of the value chain, it's not going to work. If you can't get connected, it's not going to work. So let me turn back, Andres, to you maybe on the question of the world in this part of Europe is broken. There is now again a hard line between the EU on the one hand and Russia on the other. So the whole traditional, west to east, east to west type of connectivity is not going to work in the next coming years. That's very obvious. So what do we do? How do we replace it? Are we just making our world smaller, or are we trying to make most use of the north-south connectivity and connect to partners further afield, like in Southeast Asia?
I think we are connecting to a trusted partners. I think that's really the key point. And also, just to put things into perspective, Russia is not a technology exporter. It has zero technology export. Yes, it was exporting a significant amount of fossil fuels, which we in Europe were also dependent on. But that has been cut down and will be cut down to zero. So I wouldn't, from that point of view, be too much concerned. And what it has, and I very much agree with Mark, the war what Russia is waging in Ukraine has been the great accelerator in diversifying away from Russia. And I think this is where we, in a democratic world, regardless of a geographical location, need to be really united in protecting the rules-based world order. And because this is all about it. Is our region now a safer or less safer place to invest? I would say it is by far a safer place to invest, for a simple reason. Because Finland and Sweden are going to be members of NATO. And sort of also in terms of, if we think about the market, EU is 450 million-ish marketplace with very, very high purchasing power. But NATO has a 1 billion population. That's even a bigger marketplace with very strong growth outlook. We just need to kind of conceptualize where we see the opportunities, and for me there are just many. We shouldn't be carried down or carried away with perceived might of Russia. What Russia does in Ukraine is outrageous, and those who do all these crimes, they need to be brought to justice. But we will, if anything, Russia has achieved greater unity in the West or in a democratic world, diversifying away and investment into the greener technologies. I think this is a flip side of a war, and indeed it's really speeding up also here. Have some people concerns? Yes, they do, obviously. The question is, I think what you ask, Andre, is more perhaps from the angle, are we discriminated out from the rest of a crowd in terms of investment? And that I'm not sure, because the markets have changed anyway. And we need to take a clearer look here. But going forward, there is plenty of private capital who wants to be deployed, including here. There is a lot of investment, not only in software, where we are famous, but equally increasingly more in technology. Talent attraction, I think this is where we all compete. But I think we are doing reasonably well here too. So we just need to keep going. That I think is a key point that make really this transition to a cleaner, more advanced, more technology-savvy world faster.
There is, of course, also the element of a perfect storm, which relates to the not only energy prices being high and volatile, but the inflation that it has triggered. And further, that makes the central banks move, because the core role of the central banks, of course, is price stability. So what we have seen now, that number one, the risks are up, but also the interest rates are going to climb up again. We have seen more than 10 years of negative or very low interest rates for most, and we have seen the spreads very compressed. So all the way from AAA rated institutions, further down, the difference really was small, and it has now significantly widened. And this is something that, on top of the credit risk that is prevailing, perhaps, in your normal business, plus the geopolitical now, plus the fact that the supply chains have been hit, plus then you have to pay more for your money. Howie, how does all this regional debate look from further afield? When you come to Tallinn, listen to what has been discussed in this audience, what's your reflection? Are you coming here to learn, or are you coming here to give us the opportunity to learn from you?
I think it's an opportunity to learn, because the world is changing, the world is getting crazier, and there is always a belief that together there is a lot more that we can grow, a lot more we can learn. I think that's probably kind of the philosophy that we kind of have in Singapore, because being small, we're kind of similar to Estonia. Those of you who have visited Singapore, we're kind of similar. We're very small, we're very digital. We have very proactive governments who's very digital as well. The difference we have with Estonia is very cold, but we're very hot. So that's about the difference. But Singapore being small, I think looking back to the theme of trusted connectivity, the basis of the Singapore, I'll talk about tech ecosystem because that's what I'm familiar with, has been growing on the basis of different stakeholders coming together with the belief that we do need to participate collectively in order to build a bigger pond, to build a cleaner set of infrastructure for everyone to thrive in. So we're kind of fortunate that we have large companies, we have a lot of startups, we have quite a fair bit of VC and PE funds. I just saw a report that last year the PE funds was close to about $550 billion out of Singapore for Asia. There's family offices being set up. There's research facilities. But I think what seems to be working is that everyone has come to a conclusion that in order to build something better, everyone needs to play a part. So the PPP concept that I think earlier talked about seems to be one of the things that we worked on quite a fair bit.
Okay, let's come back to the PPP concept. But let me ask you, how do we assure the quality? Who is responsible for the quality, for the standards? We heard earlier Eric Smith, for instance, talking about the AI. When that pops up, then the governments rush into action, thinking, okay, is this dangerous? But I mean, the same is also true for physical infrastructure. How do we make sure that the standards, both the structure of PPPs and so on, but also the standard for what sort of grid connection we have for these renewable energy projects, for instance, offshore and so on? How do we make sure that what we do is long-lasting and good enough standard. Is that more like the private sector or the public sector responsibility in your region? And then I hand over the same question maybe to some of the other participants to speak.
Maybe I'll give an example, because since we spend a lot of time today on AI, and prior to this role in the private sector, I was in the public sector, and before my role in the public sector, I was in the private sector, so I've been going in and out. So I kind of speak across all experiences. This whole area of AI, one of the areas that we've identified is that the need to build a better framework for AI governance and AI ethics and to remove biases as much as possible, which we spoke about. So the first step was that the government created a model AI governance framework that was published. Then they invited industry to come together to say, can we co-create and add use cases so that we're able to build this out? Because the general principles is that everyone wants our AI to be built such that it is explainable, it is transparent, it is fair, and it is human-centric. But it is a collaboration between the government regulator as well as industry to contribute to a set of use cases that is then developed into a book of knowledge that is then sent to the university to create a pedagogy and the training material, and then companies go forward to get trained. So in an odd way, we all kind of recognize that great AI comes with important responsibility to make sure that it's non-biased. And that became an example of how the universities, the governments, as well as the public sector came together because we all saw a common need. So hopefully that gives you a glimpse. We have a few other examples.
And within NCS, I mean, do you seek external financing for that? The reason I'm asking is that I have always found it difficult for bankers to kind of, go with smaller companies to start financing digitalization. To do that with larger companies is relatively easy. You take corporate risk and you trust that they know what they're doing. Now, with more kind of a startup community, fintech, etc., that is a lot more complicated to bank.
It's true, it's true. I think for NCS, we're kind of fortunate that we're currently of a good size. We're in 20 plus countries in Asia Pac. Our parent company is the largest telco in Asia. So our financing is quite well taken care of. I think what's important is not the sources of financing, but that we build within our financials not only what we need to do in the short term, but what we need to build together with the rest of the stakeholders in the long term. But you're absolutely right. I think that's where the startups and the rest of it needs a good capital base for them to build onto it as well. So I think in the ecosystem, it's going to be a combination of big players and small players. But I think this narrative where big tech needs to play a more proactive role plays out here as well. Because the bigger you are, the bigger the responsibility. And I think that's the type of ethos I think everyone should be thinking about.
And in a way, it's the spillover effect that also Eric Smith was talking about in the morning, that you can have Google doing something big, but then it also relies on smaller companies and suppliers of technology and so on. Absolutely. I think that's important. But now if we turn back to more physical infrastructure of transport and energy, maybe bringing in both Mark as well as Marko, what do you see from your perspective as to, is there more demand for PPPs? Partially, it of course depends on the country, and some countries are willing to go for PPP because it gives them faster infrastructure, not necessarily cheaper, but you can get it quicker. Do you see much PPP happening? Marko, maybe you are further afield there. Could you make a start?
Yes, thank you. No, regarding a PV project, we can give an example that we signed last year in Latvia. Is a PV project called the Kekava Bypass that we have financed together with also including NIB and other banks. I think there is the need, and there is also the willingness to go towards non-recourse finance, also project finance, especially in wind, both onshore and offshore, is a mechanism of financing where you are able to attract a lot of private funding, but also at the time we are also involved. And in fact, we can finance also a portion of the senior debt in this particular case. So we always want to have other financial institutions and other private investors and also other banks to come along with us. And I believe that thanks also to our expertise and to the fact that we do a very thorough technical, economic, and financial due diligence, this is something that gives other banks and other investors also less concern, or at least to have let's say the possibility to see that a project is, can get also financing from the EU with grants, which is also another positive things that can foster this kind of investment. So this is in a nutshell what I think, that we're going to see more project finance and PPP project in the future, definitely.
Mark?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is demand for PPPs, for public-private partnerships, and I think that they can be an extremely good model. I think in lots of cases of infrastructure investment projects or whatever, there is a role for the public sector, but you want to bring in private sector expertise and discipline and private sector finance. I think one of the things we've found through our experience is that sometimes these projects can be quite complex, and a significant amount of work needs to go into the project preparation. So actually we've been quite successful in a number of countries helping to support units which help prepare projects, which help deliver a pipeline of projects. I think that can be a successful model. I just wanted to quickly come back to this question on standards, because I think if there's a theme of today, it's about trusted partnerships, and just to pick up where Andre's left it, the importance of trusted partnership, of quality standards, of supporting a kind of rules-based system. So, clearly very important role for us as an organisation, the EBRD, in terms of promoting ESG, the ESG standards that we have. I would also argue, to link it back to the beginning, there's a importance for the private sector in terms of pushing these high quality standards. And if you want to mobilise significant amounts of private capital, you want to ensure that your investments have the highest quality standards.
And of course, the other beauty of IFI involvement is also that we are not as typical banks. We don't have the other businesses, the asset management business. We don't handle the payment flow or benefit from big customer balances. So I think for the governments, it's also an important message that when you do get an IFI involved, you get third-party scrutiny for that specific project. We want to make sure that that specific project is actually working and paying back eventually. So you do get, both the long-term financing, but also the advice and the third-party scrutiny with it. Andres, in Estonia, the PPPs have not been particularly popular. Why is it? And how do we need a change? Are we getting it right as it is, or do we need to do something differently? Now that you're no longer in the government, you can be totally open about it.
No, I was open also in the government, so it was just, in simple terms, more expensive. So, but I think the point here is, I mean, I'm not saying that PPP wouldn't work anywhere. It works in some places better, some others, on average, some others not so well. But for me, this is one technique of financing. So that you could structure the deal in the multiple ways. But I think probably the key really is a frame what the legislator and the government set. So what are the boundaries you can operate with? And I think what we have been seeing, say in the recent years, is that the regulation is becoming increasingly more detailed, which means that sort of it's not all the innovative ideas necessarily fit into this detailed regulatory boundaries. So I personally rather prefer that you would have a bit broader frame, maybe a bit more loosely defined, and then you let the innovation and different structurings to work out, and then you can, if needed, you can then nudge or change, sort of adapt the frame, but not going really to regulate each and every single small item. So that, I think, is something we should pay attention to. Now, if you ask how we can change it, I don't have any good answer, because it has, I mean, if you take the financial sector regulation, for example, I mean, it's huge. Is it doing good service all the time? Not necessarily. So, but A frame, I think, is needed. Then the question is sort of how tight you make it and how you can get the innovation to grow. And I think if we talk about investment in digital infrastructure or in energy infrastructure, I mean, in most cases it's also viable as a private business, and which is great, because if it is state-directed, then things don't always go in the right direction. I would say money is wasted. But on more sort of innovative aspects where you as a banker, because the project is not bankable, this is where I think a state can play a useful role if you do patient capital investor together with a private capital, and then sort of take perhaps less leverage and then help the great ideas to work out. I think I'm more believing in this type of solutions, and also listing the companies publicly, sort of with the government participation is always good, because when you get the governance transparent.
So one of the questions we need to ask ourselves is also, where do we find the optimal spot between bringing in innovation and private sector involvement, because that's where most of the innovation comes from, versus what sort of standards or minimum standards we have for projects and what needs to be regulated. On PPPs, of course, we should also ask ourselves a question: are we always comparing, apples to apples and oranges to oranges? Because yes, the governments can always borrow more cheaply, but there is a limit how much they can do it at a time. So that with a PPP you can accelerate certain key infrastructure developments. And coming from Estonia myself, I always thought that it's very difficult to explain to my children why is it that the road to Tartu is still the quality it is, or to Pärnu. And now apparently I need to explain that not only to my kids but also to the grandchildren. So sometimes it takes longer.
Things are not that bad. They are improving.
Good to hear. Tomáš, back to Ukraine. Based on the panel discussion that you have heard here, and of course I can understand that the short-term priorities of Ukraine are on winning the war, but the long-term priorities, and how much do you see the business associations and the government kind of thinking ahead long-term, what needs to happen after the war?
There is thinking about it. The government has done a lot of work. It was presented in Lugano in July, the reconstruction plan of Ukraine after the war. We are ourselves also watching it. I mean, private investors are also lining up for this post-war reconstruction, and there will be a lot of projects, in particular in infrastructure, where all of the financing schemes that you have discussed will be needed. And all of the institutions represented on your panel will hopefully also participate in that effort, which will be quite substantial, especially if the war lasts longer and Russia continues with its tactics to destroy cities and infrastructure to hurt Ukraine economically. But for the time being, I would say 80-90% of our focus is on a now, and on kind of making sure that our investments, our businesses here are breaking even, are surviving, and that we can pay the salaries, pay taxes, and that we live through this period. We have been here through many crises before, economic ones, with GDP declining 15-17%, but this one is obviously much deeper. We expect GDP to decline 30% this year, and hopefully stabilize next. So it's going to be a big challenge that we are actually looking forward to, because there will be a lot of energy after the war here. And as I said before, it is really surprising how the Ukrainians, the population here, how well they're dealing with this challenge and with that pressure, just judging by the amount of people that have returned back to Kiev, despite the risks. We have 85% of the population back in the city. So Ukrainians very committed, motivated, and looking forward to the war to end with Ukraine's victory, and for us to be able to focus that energy on the reconstruction.
Thank you. Any final remarks? Who wants to raise a hand? Mark.
Can I just, really just to echo what Tomáš has just said, that clearly it's great that there's thinking going into post-war Ukraine and the kind of challenges and opportunities there, but the immediate focus has to be on supporting Ukraine now and into next year. And it's extremely important that, yes, it's good that this thinking about reconstruction is happening, but it's extremely important that that doesn't detract from the immediate challenge. And we all have a role to play. And the EBRD as an institution, we are continuing to invest in Ukraine. We are investing at the same level as we invested before the war. We think that we have an important role to play in terms of we don't provide budget support to the Ministry of Finance. We don't do humanitarian support. We think we have an important role in helping the private sector and the economy to continue to function, and we are very much focused on what we can do there, as well as being involved in some of these longer-term debates about reconstruction.
And it's also, of course, about the neighboring countries where there has been a big flow of refugees and so on. So I think that's also important to keep in mind. But this takes me to the point where I would like to say that, of course, there are massive demands for infrastructure investment, and the key goal is still very obvious, that we need to build more connected, trusted partnerships. We need to accelerate the greener transition as well. And for the investors, infrastructure is not only an investment demand, but it's also an investment opportunity, where you can match your long-term assets with long-term investments. And because in this part of the world, the geopolitical dimension is of such a great importance, I think it's also really important that we do it together, that we connect, we bring both private and public sector financing into that, so that the commercial banks, the capital markets, but also the public sources of financing, be it directly from the government or from government-owned entities, but also the international financial institutions as long-term anchors of stability, do it together. So the role of IFIs during these more difficult times, I think, is clearly up. And then finally, of course, the platforms like the Tallinn Digital Summit is something where, even if we are not talking about purely digital issues, I think it's very important we get together, we share views, we bring in, success stories from Singapore and elsewhere, to help us to choose from all the options we have, the best possible. We do have 2 minutes left. If there are any questions from the audience, then I'm more than happy to give you the floor. Do we have any hands going up? There is one. Could we get the microphone here in the front row? And if you could just, you were in the previous panel, but if you could just once again say your name and then address the question to...
Thanks, Kosh. It's to everybody per se, but perhaps more the EBRD and EIB fellows. One of the things we heard a lot about was the G7, there's this partnership for global infrastructure investments. To actually operationalize it, you need to be able to at least pool your resources in a coordinated way. Either there's coordinated funding or complementary funding or sequential funding, whatever. And the main sort of hurdles to that are administrative. Different banks have different rules of how much country, how much sort of nexus there is. So any thoughts on that? How can we sort of actually put our money where our words are, or other way around? Because we talk a lot about it, but unless that sort of modalities are developed, these are all parallel exercises, not a coordinated exercise. Thanks.
Maybe, Mark, if you could take it first, and perhaps Marco can say a few words.
It's a very good question. I think I'd say a couple of things. I mean, first of all, my earlier point that, if we are working in a particular country, the impediments to investment, the kind of challenges in mobilizing private sector investment can be very country specific. So you have to really understand the circumstances and what the potential blockages are, and the blockages can often be political or political economy blockages, but I completely agree with you. I think there is a challenge in terms of ensuring that the MDBs, the IFIs work together and cooperate on the ground. Often that has to happen at a country level. I think there are some very good examples of where we do it well, and I spend a lot of my time traveling, and when I travel to a country I will meet other MDBs, IFIs on the ground. Often you see excellent cooperation, sometimes not so good cooperation, but I think it's a big challenge and it's a big issue that we need to address.
Thank you, Mark. And very quickly, Marco, you have the last word. We cannot hear you. Can you switch on your microphone? Try again.
Hello?
Yes, now we can hear you. Go.
Can you hear me? Yes. So very quickly, so regarding cooperation with IFI, it's a big topic. What I can say is that the Team Europe initiative is an approach that allows all EU development partners to put their respective knowledge and resources across the different priority areas under the global gateway and align towards common strategic objective. And the IB is very active in the Team Europe initiative. I would like to make also some example regarding the Clean Ocean Initiative. This was launched in 2018 with IFD and KfW. And the objective was to finance 2 billion project that will reduce plastic waste by 2023. In 2020, also CDP and ECO, so the Italian and Spanish NPIs, joined. And in February 2022, also EBRD became the 6th member of the Clean Ocean Initiative. And this initiative would raise 4 billion by 2035. So this is an example in which when we have a common goals, common objective, we can actually team up and allocate all the resources in one direction. And of course, I would like also to mention that 2 weeks ago, Andre with all NIB was visited us in Luxembourg, and both European Investment Bank and Nordic Investment Bank have a long track record of financing large project and infrastructure project together. In the last 5 years, I think we've done more than 10 billion. So definitely it's something that we should do more to work more together, and actually I'm going to talk about the framework agreement with DRB that we have, and we should also contribute to have a more united approach and to streamline all the procedures, so in order that the project are financed to our policy objective. Thank you.
Thank you, Marco, and thank you for the question. Just to add, yes, IFIs do cooperate, and in the end the client or the investee company or the borrower chooses who they work with, but sometimes you do need deeper pockets. With this, we have run out of our time. Thank you very much for your attention, and I will hand it over to the organizers, thanking the panel out here, and best greetings to both Vilnius and Kiev.